March 18, 1945, 10 miles south of Krefeld, Germany. The Rhine River. Private First Class Bernie Bluestein crouched behind an inflatable Sherman tank, listening to German artillery shells scream overhead. He was 19 years old, an art student from Cleveland, and he was supposed to be dead. Not because of the shells. Those were exploding harmlessly in an open field, destroying rubber decoys that weighed 93 pounds instead of 32 tons. No. Bluestein was supposed to be dead because if the Germans figured out what he and the other men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were actually doing here, they'd be slaughtered. Because Bluestein and his unit weren't real soldiers. Not in the traditional sense. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, actors playing the role of their lives on a stage made of mud and blood, performing for an audience that would kill them if they discovered the show was fake. The 23rd was pretending to be two entire divisions. 40,000 men. With nothing but inflatable tanks, sound effects records, and the kind of creative audacity that would make a Hollywood director jealous. Through the darkness, Bluestein could hear the sonic trucks playing their soundtrack. The rumble of tanks moving into position, the sounds of pontoon bridges being constructed. The shouts of officers directing troops, all of it fake. All of it recorded weeks ago and now being broadcast through massive speakers aimed at German listening posts across the river. Somewhere 10 miles north, the real Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine at the actual target location. If this worked, if the Germans believed the fake army was real, thousands of American lives would be saved. If it didn't work well, Bluestein tried not to think about that. He adjusted the camouflage netting on his rubber tank, making sure it looked authentic from the air, and thought about how he'd ended up here. About the recruitment notice on his art school bulletin board. About signing up for what he thought would be a safe desk job painting camouflage. About arriving in Europe and discovering his job was to fool the German army from a few hundred yards away while armed with nothing heavier than a carbine rifle. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the most unusual military unit in American history. A traveling roadshow of deception that operated across Europe from D-Day to the end of the war. 1,000 men who waged war with paintbrushes and loudspeakers instead of guns. A top-secret unit whose story remained classified for over 50 years. The story of how artists saved thousands of lives by lying more convincingly than anyone thought possible. The Ghost Army didn't start with the United States. It started with the British in the deserts of North Africa, where they discovered that in modern warfare, sometimes what the enemy thinks they see is more important than what's actually there. In 1941, the British 8th Army was facing Rommel's Afrika Korps, and they were outnumbered, outgunned, and desperate. A British officer named Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician in civilian life, proposed something radical. Instead of hiding their forces, they should create fake ones. Make the Germans think British units were in places they weren't. Force Rommel to divide his forces chasing shadows. The British tried it. They built dummy tanks from plywood and canvas. They created fake artillery positions. They generated false radio traffic, and it worked. The Germans fell for it. They moved units to counter threats that didn't exist, weakening their defenses where the real attack came. American military planners in London heard about these successes and started thinking. The Allies were planning the invasion of Europe, D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in history. They'd need every advantage they could get. What if they had a dedicated unit specifically designed for tactical deception? A mobile force that could move up and down the front lines, creating illusions wherever they were needed? Two men championed this idea, Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll. Ingersoll was a particularly interesting character. In civilian life, he'd been the managing editor of the New Yorker magazine, publisher of Fortune, and founder of the New York newspaper called PM. He understood media, propaganda, and how to manipulate perception. He also understood that modern warfare was increasingly about information and deception, not just brute force. Harris and Ingersoll pitched the concept up the chain of command. They argued that a specialized deception unit could multiply the effectiveness of real combat forces. Make the enemy think American armies were twice as large as they actually were. Force the Germans to spread their defenses thinner. Create confusion and uncertainty in German intelligence. The pitch worked. On January 20th, 1944, the United States Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Authorization called for 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. Their mission: to deceive the Axis forces about the size and location of Allied forces using any means necessary. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't going to be a normal military unit. They needed men who could think creatively, who could improvise, who could solve problems that had no standard military solution. They needed artists, designers, engineers, sound technicians, actors. They needed people whose brains worked differently than typical soldiers. The recruitment was unusual. The Army sent notices to art schools across the country. Cooper Union in New York, Pratt Institute. Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. The notices were vague. Wanted. Men for camouflage unit. Must have artistic ability. No combat role. Many young artists, facing the draft anyway, figured this was better than the infantry. They signed up. Bernie Bluestein saw one of these notices at his art college in Cleveland in March 1943. He was 19, studying to be a painter, and the draft was looming. The recruitment notice said they needed artists for a non-combat camouflage unit. That sounded perfect. Paint some tanks green, stay far from the front lines, survive the war, go back to art school. He enlisted. What Bluestein didn't know, what none of the recruits knew, was that this non-combat camouflage unit would operate within a few hundred yards of German positions. That they'd be creating deceptions so close to the enemy that German artillery could hit them. That being captured would likely mean execution, because the Germans wouldn't treat deception specialists kindly. The recruitment net caught an extraordinary collection of people. Bill Blass, who would become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of the 20th century's most important abstract painters. Art Kane, who would become a legendary photographer. Dozens of other talented artists whose names never became famous but whose skills were exactly what the Ghost Army needed. The unit also recruited from other sources. West Point graduates provided military expertise. Men from the Army Specialized Training Program brought technical knowledge. Radio operators who could mimic the telegraphic fist of other units' operators. Sound engineers who understood acoustics and audio equipment. The 23rd reportedly had one of the highest average IQs in the Army, 119. Training began at Camp Forest, Tennessee, then moved to several other locations as the unit developed its capabilities. The men learned conventional military skills, how to march, shoot, perform guard duty. But they also learned unconventional skills, how to inflate rubber tanks, how to operate sonic equipment, how to impersonate other units, how to lie convincingly. The unit was divided into 4 main components, each with a specific deception specialty. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion handled visual deception. These were the artists, the men who would create fake tanks, trucks, artillery, and airplanes. They learned how to use inflatable decoys, how to camouflage them imperfectly so aerial reconnaissance would spot them, how to create entire fake bivouacs complete with laundry hanging on clotheslines. The 3132nd Signal Service Company handled sonic deception. They had trucks mounted with massive speakers and a library of sound effects recordings. Tanks moving, artillery firing, troops marching, officers shouting orders. These sounds could be projected up to 15 miles in ideal conditions, making the Germans think major forces were assembling where there was nothing but empty fields and recorded noise. The Signal Company Special handled radio deception. These were specialists who could generate fake radio traffic mimicking real units. They could copy the transmission patterns, the radio operator's individual fist, in Morse code, even the types of messages a real unit would send. German intelligence monitored Allied radio traffic constantly, trying to track unit locations and intentions. The radio deception team fed them false information that seemed completely authentic. The 406th Combat Engineer Company handled security and helped with physical setup. They were the closest thing the Ghost Army had to traditional soldiers, and their job was to protect the deception teams while they worked. By May 1944, the Ghost Army was ready. Or as ready as they'd ever be. They shipped to England, arriving shortly before D-Day. They didn't participate in the initial invasion, but they'd get their chance soon enough. Europe was waiting. And the German army had no idea what was about to hit them. Let's talk about how the Ghost Army actually worked. Because creating a convincing illusion of a 40,000-man division with 1,100 men and inflatable tanks required careful planning, technical sophistication, and creative problem-solving. The centerpiece of the Ghost Army's visual deception was the inflatable M4 Sherman tank. This thing was a masterpiece of wartime engineering. When deflated and packed, it fit into a duffel bag that one man could carry. When fully inflated, it was 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches tall to the top of the turret. Exactly the dimensions of a real Sherman. The tank was constructed from rubberized canvas stretched over a framework of inflatable tubes. The whole thing weighed 93 pounds fully inflated. 4 men could set one up in about 20 minutes using portable air compressors powered by gasoline. For comparison, a real Sherman tank weighed 32 tons and required a trained crew and heavy transport equipment. The inflatables were manufactured by a consortium of American companies including U.S. Rubber, Goodyear, and believe it or not, the Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company in Scranton, Pennsylvania. 16-year-old Teresa Ricard worked at the U.S. Rubber facility in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, after school, earning 49 cents an hour to cement and fold the rubber tubes that became tanks. She and the other workers called them targets, though they weren't told exactly what they'd be used for. The key to making inflatable tanks look real from the air was detail. The Ghost Army artists painted on panel lines, hatches, tools, all the small features that real tanks had. They weathered them to look used. They positioned them slightly imperfectly, the way real tank crews would park their vehicles. They'd sometimes leave a deflated tank or two lying around as if it was broken down and awaiting repair, because real units always had some equipment out of service. The Ghost Army also had inflatable trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, and even light observation aircraft. Creating a fake division meant deploying about 600 of these inflatables in careful arrangements that mimicked how real units would position their equipment. But visual deception was only part of the equation. The Germans had aerial reconnaissance, sure, but they also had listening posts, monitoring radio transmissions, and microphones picking up sounds from Allied positions. The Ghost Army had to fool all these intelligence sources simultaneously. The sonic deception was perhaps the most technically sophisticated aspect. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company operated trucks called heaters, equipped with massive speakers and turntables that could play specialized recordings. These weren't normal phonograph records. They were custom recordings made specifically for military deception. The sonic library included sounds of tanks moving, including the distinctive clatter of tracks on different terrain, trucks' convoy movements, with proper spacing between vehicles, pontoon bridge construction, complete with hammering and shouting, artillery batteries firing, infantry units assembling, with voices, equipment rattling, and general activity sounds. Even specific things like officers swearing at troops to put out their cigarettes. The recordings had to be accurate enough to fool German sound analysts who were trained to identify Allied unit types by their acoustic signatures. The sonic teams would study the actual sounds made by real units, record them, then play them back in locations where the Ghost Army wanted Germans to think those units were located. The speakers could project sound up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. The sonic trucks would position themselves carefully, usually within a few hundred yards of the front lines, close enough that Germans could hear clearly but hopefully far enough that they wouldn't be immediately overrun if the Germans attacked. Radio deception added another layer of authenticity. The Signal Company Special would set up fake radio networks mimicking the communications patterns of real divisions. This was incredibly technical work. Every radio operator has a distinctive fist in Morse code, the way they send dots and dashes. It's like a fingerprint. The Ghost Army radio operators studied recordings of real operators from the units they were impersonating, learning to copy those patterns exactly. They generate the types of traffic a real division would send: situation reports, supply requests, movement orders, routine administrative messages. The messages had to make sense, had to fit the narrative of a real unit doing real things. German intelligence monitored all Allied radio traffic, plotting unit locations, tracking movements, assessing intentions. The Ghost Army fed them data that looked completely authentic, but was completely fake. The fourth element was what the Ghost Army called special effects, or atmosphere. This meant soldiers from the unit would go into nearby towns wearing the patches and insignia of the unit they were impersonating. They'd visit bars and cafes, talk loudly about their unit's activities, drop hints about future operations, all while knowing that German spies or sympathizers might be listening. They'd set up fake command posts with appropriate signage and activity. They'd create traffic patterns that looked like a real division headquarters. They'd have officers who looked like generals moving around in vehicles with the appropriate flags and markings. Everything was designed to create a convincing picture for German intelligence. The Ghost Army could set up a full divisional deception in about 8 hours. They'd arrive at a location after dark, start inflating tanks and positioning equipment, set up sonic trucks and radio stations, and by dawn have created the appearance of a major force that hadn't been there the night before. And then, when their mission was complete, they'd pack it all up and move to the next operation. They were literally a traveling roadshow, putting on performances designed to fool the German army. The men became experts at their craft. They learned which details mattered and which didn't. They learned that from a quarter-mile away, an inflatable tank was indistinguishable from a real one. They learned that the sounds of construction were more convincing if they included mistakes and stops and starts, because that's how real work sounded. They learned that radio traffic needed occasional errors and corrections because perfect communications looked suspicious. But here's the thing they all had to live with. If the Germans figured out the deception, the men of the Ghost Army were vulnerable. They had carbines and some .50 caliber machine guns for defense, but they weren't a combat unit. If the Germans attacked with armor or artillery, the Ghost Army couldn't fight back effectively. Their only real defense was making the enemy believe they were something they weren't. That took a special kind of courage. Sitting in a field surrounded by rubber tanks, playing recordings of armor movements, wearing fake patches and hoping the Germans fell for it. Knowing that if German infantry came through the woods, you were armed with a rifle and the ability to draw convincing sketches, and only one of those would be useful. 3 members of the Ghost Army were killed during the war. Around 30 were wounded. Not huge numbers compared to combat units, but remember, these were artists and designers. Young men who'd joined thinking they'd be painting trucks far from the fighting. Instead, they found themselves operating close enough to the front that German artillery could target them, close enough that a German breakthrough would overrun them immediately. Bernie Bluestein, the 19-year-old art student from Cleveland, later said, "If I had known that before I got into the service, I probably would have made a different decision, but he and the others did their jobs anyway, because that's what the mission required." The Ghost Army's first major operation came in August 1944, about 2 months after D-Day. The Allies had successfully landed in Normandy and were pushing inland, but progress was slower than hoped. German forces were fighting fierce defensive battles, and the Allies needed every advantage they could get. General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing across France in a brilliant campaign of rapid movement. Patton was everything a combat general should be: aggressive, decisive, willing to take risks. His armored divisions were slicing through French territory, liberating towns, destroying German forces, advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. But there was a problem. The German-held port of Brest, on the western tip of France's Brittany Peninsula, was still in enemy hands. Brest had a major garrison, strong fortifications, and strategic importance. Taking it would tie down Allied forces that Patton needed for his eastern advance. The solution? Make the Germans think Patton's forces were focusing on Brest while actually racing eastward. And that's where the Ghost Army came in. Operation Brittany was the Ghost Army's first large-scale deception, and it was a crash course in what would become their signature tactics. The unit moved to the area around Brest and created the illusion that Patton's armored and infantry divisions were massing for a major assault on the port. They deployed about 50 inflatable tanks in carefully arranged formations that mimicked how real armored units would position their vehicles. They set up fake bivouac areas with tents, vehicles, and activity that looked like thousands of soldiers preparing for battle. The sonic trucks played their recordings, tanks moving, troops assembling, artillery being positioned. The sounds carried to German listening posts, creating the impression of major force concentrations. The radio teams generated traffic suggesting supply problems, unit movements, coordination between elements of Patton's army. All fake, all designed to make the Germans think a major offensive against Brest was imminent. And it worked. German intelligence reported to their commanders that Patton was bringing substantial forces to bear against Brest. The Germans strengthened the garrison, brought in reinforcements, and prepared for an assault that was never coming. Meanwhile, the real Third Army continued its eastward advance, moving so fast that German units couldn't establish effective defensive lines. Patton's forces liberated town after town, disrupted German communications and supply lines, and created chaos in the German rear areas. But Operation Brittany also taught the Ghost Army some harsh lessons about the reality of their mission. First, they learned that operating near the front lines meant being under fire. German artillery shelled the areas where the Ghost Army had positioned their fake tanks. The shells destroyed inflatables, sending rubber fragments flying. The men took cover in foxholes and trenches, experiencing for the first time what combat soldiers dealt with constantly. One Ghost Army soldier crouched in a foxhole while shells exploded around rubber tanks. Thought about the absurdity of the situation, he'd joined to paint camouflage. Now he was cowering in a hole while the Germans destroyed toys. But the destruction proved the deception was working. The Germans thought those targets were worth shelling. Second, they learned that sonic deception required getting close to the enemy. Uncomfortably close. The sonic trucks had to position themselves within a few hundred yards of German positions to make the sounds convincing. That meant the crews were exposed, vulnerable, operating in range of German small arms fire if the enemy launched an attack. Third, they learned that the mental stress of deception work was different from, but not less than the stress of combat. Combat soldiers could fight back when attacked. Ghost Army soldiers could only maintain their illusion and hope the enemy didn't call their bluff. It was a different kind of fear, no less real. Despite these challenges, Operation Brittany succeeded. The Germans didn't realize until too late that Patton's main force was far to the east. By the time they figured out they'd been fooled, Patton had advanced so far that the strategic situation had completely changed. For the Ghost Army, Operation Brittany proved their concept worked. They could create convincing illusions that fooled German intelligence. They could operate near the front lines despite minimal combat arms. And they could contribute meaningfully to Allied success. But the operation also revealed areas for improvement. The inflatable tanks needed better camouflage details. The sonic recordings needed more variety. The radio deception needed tighter coordination with actual Allied communications to avoid contradictions. The Ghost Army soldiers learned their craft quickly because they had to. There was no instruction manual for this kind of warfare. They were making it up as they went, learning from each operation, refining their techniques, becoming more sophisticated in their deceptions. After Brittany, the Ghost Army moved to their next assignment, and the next, and the next. They became a traveling roadshow of illusion, moving up and down the front lines wherever deception was needed. In September 1944, during Patton's assault on the heavily fortified French city of Metz, a gap opened in the American line. Patton's forces had advanced faster than supporting units could keep up, leaving a vulnerable section where German counterattacks could break through. The Ghost Army was rushed to that gap. For 7 days, they maintained the illusion of a full division occupying defensive positions while the real division arrived and deployed. They inflated tanks, played sounds of troops digging in, generated radio traffic of a unit preparing defensive positions. German probes tested the line but didn't launch major attacks, possibly because their intelligence suggested strong American forces were present. When the real division arrived, they found the Ghost Army had held a critical position with nothing but rubber and recordings. One Ghost Army officer, reflecting on that operation, said it was more nerve-wracking than anything he'd experienced in the war. They weren't just creating an illusion. They were the only thing standing between the German army and a breakthrough that could have caused serious problems for Patton's advance. If the Germans had attacked in force, the Ghost Army couldn't have stopped them. They could only have retreated and hoped the Germans didn't realize they'd been fooled until the real unit arrived. The soldiers of the Ghost Army developed a dark humor about their situation. They joked that their unit motto should be "We die so others can live," or "Making the world safe for rubber." They'd award medals to rubber tanks that survived multiple operations without being destroyed. They'd place bets on how long it would take German artillery to find their positions after they set up a new deception. But beneath the humor was the recognition that their work mattered. Every operation that succeeded meant real combat units could advance with less resistance. Every German unit that moved to counter a fake threat was a unit not defending against a real attack. Every German shell that destroyed a rubber tank was a shell that didn't hit real soldiers. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted multiple operations across France. They'd worked with Patton's Third Army, with Hodge's First Army, with Simpson's Ninth Army. The generals appreciated what the Ghost Army could do, especially Patton, who understood the value of deception and misdirection in warfare. Patton, according to Ghost Army members, was actually one of the easiest generals to work with. He embraced their ideas, made suggestions to improve the deceptions, and ensured they had the support they needed. He understood that warfare wasn't just about shooting. It was about making the enemy think you were stronger, larger, and somewhere different than you actually were. As winter approached and the war ground on, the Ghost Army had proven themselves invaluable. But their biggest test was still ahead. An operation that would use every technique they'd developed, push them closer to the enemy than ever before, and demonstrate that 1,000 men with creativity could fool an entire German army. That operation was called Weyersen, and it would be the Ghost Army's masterpiece. By March 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Allies had pushed the Germans back across France through Belgium and were now facing the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier protecting Germany itself. Cross the Rhine, and the road to Berlin was open. But crossing the Rhine wasn't going to be easy. The Germans knew it was coming. They'd fortified the eastern bank. They'd positioned artillery to cover likely crossing points. They'd placed reserves to counterattack any bridgehead. The Rhine crossing would be dangerous, costly, and difficult. Lieutenant General William Simpson's 9th Army was tasked with making one of the major crossings. His staff studied the river, analyzed the terrain, and identified the best location, near the town of Wesel, in the 16th Corps sector. The terrain there was favorable, the German defenses were relatively weaker, and the river was crossable with proper engineering support. But the Germans would figure out that Wesel was the logical crossing point. They'd concentrate their forces there. They'd shell the crossing with artillery. They'd counterattack the bridgehead with armor. The crossing would succeed eventually, but it would cost thousands of American lives. Unless the Germans could be convinced the crossing was happening somewhere else. That's where the Ghost Army came in. Lieutenant Colonel Marek Truly, the Ghost Army's liaison officer attached to 9th Army's G3 section, helped develop the deception plan called Operation Weyersen. The concept was audacious even by Ghost Army standards. The Ghost Army would position itself about 10 miles south of the real crossing site, near the town of Weyersen. They would create the illusion that 2 entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, were massing for a crossing in the Weyersen area. They would make the Germans think that Weyersen was the actual target, forcing the Germans to divide their forces and weakening the defenses at Wesel where the real crossing would occur. This would be the Ghost Army's largest operation. They would deploy over 600 inflatable vehicles. They would use every sonic recording they had. They would generate radio traffic for 2 complete divisions. They would send men into towns wearing 30th and 79th Division patches. They would create fake command posts, fake supply dumps, fake everything. And they would do it all within artillery range of the Germans, close enough that if the deception failed, they'd be massacred. The operation began on March 18, 1945. The Ghost Army moved into position south of Weyersen after dark. Trucks carrying deflated tanks and equipment rolled in under the cover of darkness. By dawn on March 19th, the transformation was complete. Where empty fields had been the night before, German reconnaissance flights now saw 2 divisions worth of vehicles and equipment, tanks in careful revetments, artillery pieces positioned to support a river crossing, trucks and jeeps arranged in bivouac areas, supply dumps stacked with fake ammunition and fuel, headquarters tents with appropriate markings and radio antennas. The inflatable setup was more sophisticated than anything the Ghost Army had attempted before. Each division had nearly 100 rubber vehicles, including 5 inflatable liaison planes positioned at fake airstrips. The artists had arranged everything to match how real divisions would deploy before a major operation. But the visual deception was only the beginning. The sonic trucks went to work, playing their library of recordings around the clock. During the day, they played sounds of construction, hammering, sawing, the noise of pontoon bridge sections being assembled. This suggested engineering units were preparing for the crossing. At night, they played sounds of vehicles moving, tank engines, truck convoys, the clatter of tracked vehicles on roads. This suggested units were continuing to arrive and reinforce the area. Mixed in were sounds of routine military activity, officers shouting orders, troops talking, equipment being maintained. All the normal sounds of an army preparing for battle. The Germans heard all of it. Their listening posts picked up the sounds and reported back. Major American forces assembling near Weyersen. Significant activity suggesting an imminent crossing. 2 divisions at minimum, possibly more. The radio deception was equally comprehensive. The Ghost Army radio operators generated traffic mimicking the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. They copied the Morse code patterns of real operators from those units. They sent messages about supply requests, personnel movements, coordination between battalions, all the routine traffic a division generates. They even made deliberate small mistakes, sending corrections, occasionally having an operator go off frequency and have to be called back. Because perfect radio discipline would have looked suspicious. Real units made mistakes, had technical problems, occasionally screwed up. The Ghost Army's radio deception included those realistic imperfections. German intelligence monitored the radio traffic and plotted the units on their maps. The 30th Division was near Wörsen, preparing to cross. The 79th Division was in support. Multiple intelligence sources confirmed major American crossing planned in the Wörsen area. The Ghost Army soldiers, meanwhile, were living on the edge of disaster. German artillery shelled their positions regularly. Shells exploded among the rubber tanks, destroying them. The men would scramble out of their holes, drag the wrecked rubber away, inflate new tanks, and reposition them. They had to maintain the illusion even under fire. Some of the Ghost Army soldiers were sent into nearby towns wearing 30th and 79th Division patches. They'd visit cafes and bars, deliberately talking loudly about their units, dropping hints about upcoming operations, complaining about the challenges of river crossings, all while knowing German spies might be listening. They were playing roles like actors in a deadly play. Real engineering units were attached to the Ghost Army to add authenticity. These engineers assembled actual pontoon bridge sections near the river, creating noise and activity that German observers could see and hear. The bridge sections weren't enough for an actual crossing, but from a distance, they looked like preparation for one. The Ghost Army even used flash canisters to simulate artillery fire. At night, they'd set off explosives that created the flash and sound of artillery batteries firing, suggesting the American forces were conducting pre-assault bombardments. The Germans responded with heavy artillery fire of their own. They shelled what they thought were American positions. They destroyed rubber tanks, inflatable trucks, fake artillery pieces. From their perspective across the river, they were causing significant damage to an American force preparing to cross. German intelligence reports from those days show that the deception worked completely. They believed 2 American divisions were massing near Wörsen. They moved artillery to cover that sector. They positioned reserves to counterattack any crossing in that area. They prepared for the assault they were certain was coming. On the night of March 23, 1945, the 9th Army launched its actual Rhine crossing near Wesel, 10 miles north of where the Ghost Army had created their illusion. The 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, the real units the Ghost Army had been impersonating, crossed the river and established bridgeheads. The German response was disorganized and weaker than expected. They'd been looking in the wrong place. Their reserves were positioned to counter an attack at Wörsen. Their artillery was targeting empty fields full of rubber tanks. By the time they realized they'd been fooled, the American bridgehead was established and reinforcements were pouring across. The 30th Division's G2 intelligence officer later reported that the American attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy with a consequent saving of American lives. The 79th Division's G2 captured a German map of the American order of battle just before the attack. It showed the 79th positioned approximately where the Ghost Army had portrayed it. They'd lost track of the 30th entirely. 9th Army intelligence stated after the operation that the Germans had expected the main Allied effort to be made north of Wesel with a minor crossing opposite Krefeld, exactly where the Ghost Army had created their phantom divisions. Operation Wörsen was a complete success. The Ghost Army had fooled the German army at a critical moment, drawing forces away from the real crossing point and enabling the 9th Army to establish bridgeheads with minimal resistance. Estimates suggest the deception saved anywhere from 15,000 to 30,000 American lives. For the Ghost Army soldiers, Wörsen was validation of everything they'd done. All the training, all the operations, all the time spent under fire maintaining illusions had led to this. They'd created their most elaborate deception, their most convincing show, and it had worked perfectly when it mattered most. But Wörsen was also the Ghost Army's last major operation. By late March 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. The Rhine had been crossed. Allied forces were pushing into Germany. The German army was collapsing. There would be a few more small operations, but nothing on the scale of Wörsen. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had completed their mission. They conducted over 20 deception operations across Europe. They'd impersonated divisions, created phantom armies, and fooled the Germans repeatedly. They'd saved thousands of lives by convincing the enemy to fight shadows instead of real American soldiers. And now, as the war wound down, they faced a different challenge: going home and never telling anyone what they'd really done. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ghost Army was who these men were. They weren't professional soldiers. They were artists, designers, and creative people who'd been drafted or enlisted and then found themselves in the strangest military unit in the Army. Take Bill Blass. Before the war, he was an aspiring fashion designer from Fort Wayne, Indiana. At 18, he became the first man to win Mademoiselle's Design for a Living award. He was talented, ambitious, and headed for a career in fashion. Then the war happened. Blass enlisted in 1943 and ended up assigned to the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion, the visual deception component of the Ghost Army. His fashion design skills translated perfectly to camouflage work. He understood color, texture, visual presentation, how to make things look different than they were. Blass spent the war inflating rubber tanks, painting details on dummy artillery pieces, and creating visual illusions designed to fool German reconnaissance. He even retailored his own uniform so it fit better, because even in a war zone, Blass cared about appearance. After the war, Blass returned to New York and built one of the most successful fashion houses in America. He designed clothes for presidents, celebrities, and wealthy clients around the world. He became a household name in American fashion. But he couldn't talk about what he'd really done during the war. The Ghost Army remained classified. In interviews decades later, after declassification, Blass would reflect that his time in the Ghost Army taught him valuable lessons about presentation, illusion, and how perception shapes reality. "I learned a lot fooling people," he said, "and it stood me in good stead my whole life." Ellsworth Kelly was another artist who served in the Ghost Army. Kelly was a young painter when he enlisted, still finding his artistic voice. He'd studied at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn before being drafted. In the Ghost Army, Kelly was assigned to the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. He designed camouflage patterns, painted details on inflatable equipment, and created visual deceptions. But he also found time to sketch and paint whenever possible. The Ghost Army soldiers, when not actively operating, had time to pursue their art. They'd sketch the French and Belgian countryside, paint portraits of fellow soldiers, document their experiences in visual form. Kelly filled sketchbooks with drawings of what he saw: destroyed towns, military equipment, the landscape of war. After the war, Kelly became one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. His bold geometric works hang in major museums worldwide. His artistic vision was shaped partly by his wartime experiences, though he rarely discussed the details of his Ghost Army service. Art Kane was a photographer who served in the Ghost Army's Sonic Deception Unit. In civilian life, Kane worked in advertising and was developing his photography skills. In the Ghost Army, he operated sonic equipment, helping to project the sounds of phantom armies. After the war, Kane became one of the most famous photographers in America. His portrait, A Great Day in Harlem, showing 57 jazz musicians gathered on a New York street in 1958, became one of the most iconic photographs in jazz history. Kane's work appeared in major magazines and defined visual aesthetics for a generation. But like Blass and Kelly, Kane couldn't discuss his wartime service. The Ghost Army was classified, so when people asked what he did in the war, he'd give vague answers about special operations or just change the subject. The Ghost Army was full of men like this. Artists who would go on to significant post-war careers, but who spent crucial years creating military illusions instead of art for galleries. Their talent was redirected toward deception, toward creating convincing lies that saved lives. Some of the Ghost Army artists continued their work even during operations. They'd set up inflatable tanks, then during quiet periods, they'd sketch the scene. They'd paint watercolors of the French villages they passed through. They'd document their experiences in visual form, creating a unique record of the war from the perspective of artist soldiers. Jack Massey, another Ghost Army artist, even created and printed a book during the war called You on KP, filled with caricatures of his fellow soldiers. It was a humorous take on military life, passed around the unit and treasured by the men who appeared in it. This artistic community within the Ghost Army created a unique culture. They weren't typical soldiers focused solely on military objectives. They were creative people who understood that their work required imagination, improvisation, and thinking differently than conventional military units. They'd have discussions about art and design while inflating rubber tanks. They'd critique each other's camouflage work, suggesting ways to make an inflatable truck look more realistic. They'd share techniques for creating convincing visual deceptions. One Ghost Army soldier described it as art school with artillery. They were learning their craft, refining their skills, pushing the boundaries of what deception could accomplish, all while German shells exploded around them. The unit also attracted people from other creative fields. Radio broadcasters who understood how to create convincing audio, sound engineers who knew acoustics and audio equipment, actors who could play roles convincingly, advertising men who understood how to manipulate perception. Ralph Ingersoll, one of the men who'd helped create the Ghost Army concept, embodied this connection between creative fields and military deception. As a magazine editor and publisher, he'd understood how to shape narratives, how to present information in ways that influenced how people thought. Those skills translated directly to military deception. The Ghost Army proved that creative thinking had military value. That artists, designers, and other creative professionals could contribute to war efforts in ways beyond traditional combat roles. That intelligence and imagination could be as valuable as firepower. But the creative nature of the Ghost Army also created challenges. These men weren't trained soldiers. They hadn't grown up learning military discipline and hierarchy. They were independent thinkers who questioned things, who wanted to understand why they were doing what they were doing. Officers who commanded Ghost Army units had to adapt their leadership styles. You couldn't just order these men to do things without explanation. They needed to understand the mission, to see how their work fit into the larger plan. Once they understood, they'd work incredibly hard and creatively. But they needed that understanding first. Colonel Harry Reeder, who commanded the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, recognized this and adapted accordingly. He treated his men more like collaborators than subordinates. He explained missions thoroughly, invited suggestions and improvements, and gave the creative soldiers room to develop their own solutions to problems. This approach worked. The Ghost Army became more effective as the men understood their role and developed pride in their unique capabilities. They weren't regular soldiers, and they didn't need to be. They were specialists conducting specialized operations that regular units couldn't accomplish. The artistic output of the Ghost Army during the war was substantial. The men produced hundreds of sketches, paintings, and drawings documenting their experiences. Much of this work was personal, created during downtime, and kept in private collections. Some was official, documenting equipment and operations for military records. After the war, some of this artwork surfaced in galleries and museums. Paintings showing rubber tanks in French fields, sketches of German villages seen from American positions, portraits of fellow soldiers, landscapes of war-torn Europe. The artwork provides a unique perspective on World War II. These weren't combat artists sent to document the front lines. These were soldiers who happened to be artists, creating work that reflected their dual roles as military personnel and creative individuals. One particularly poignant collection shows camouflage patterns and design studies. The artists of the 603rd would experiment with different approaches to making inflatable equipment look real. They'd sketch variations, test different color schemes, develop techniques for adding realistic weathering and detail. It was technical work, but approached with artistic sensibility. The Ghost Army story demonstrates something important about warfare. It's not just about firepower and numbers. It's about information, perception, and psychology. The side that can control what the enemy thinks they see has a significant advantage. And who better to control perception than artists, designers, and creative people who understood how visual presentation shapes reality? The Ghost Army took those skills, applied them to military problems, and created a form of warfare that hadn't existed before. The Ghost Army story is often told as a clever tale of artists fooling the Germans with rubber tanks and sound effects. And it is that. But it's also a story about real danger, real casualties, and the psychological cost of conducting warfare through deception. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed during their operations in Europe. That number sounds small compared to infantry units that lost dozens or hundreds of men in single battles. But remember, these were artists and designers who joined expecting a non-combat role. They thought they'd be painting trucks far from the fighting. Instead, they found themselves operating within artillery range of German positions. The first Ghost Army casualty died during an operation when German artillery bracketed their position. One shell landed close enough that shrapnel hit several men. One died from his wounds despite immediate medical attention. The others were evacuated. The unit held a memorial service. The commanding officer spoke about service and sacrifice. But the men struggled with the loss in ways that combat units didn't. Combat soldiers expected casualties. They were prepared for it, trained for it, hardened to it through experience. The Ghost Army soldiers hadn't been prepared the same way. They were creative people thrust into danger and losing one of their own hit differently. Around 30 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded during their operations, some by artillery fire, some by small arms fire during operations close to German lines. Others in vehicle accidents, which were common in wartime conditions with units moving at night without lights on damaged roads. The wounded were evacuated back to field hospitals, treated and sometimes returned to duty. Others were too badly wounded and were sent home. Each casualty reminded the remaining men that despite the unusual nature of their mission, the danger was absolutely real. But the physical casualties only tell part of the story. The psychological cost of Ghost Army service was significant and largely unrecognized. Think about what these men were doing. They were maintaining elaborate deceptions while operating close to enemy forces. They had to act confidently, as if they were part of real divisions, while knowing they were surrounded by rubber and recordings. They had to maintain perfect operational security, never letting slip that they were actually a tiny deception unit. And they had to live with the knowledge that if the Germans figured out the deception, they were vulnerable. The Ghost Army had minimal defensive capabilities. If German armor or infantry attacked, they couldn't hold. They could only retreat and hope the Germans didn't realize they'd been fooled until it was too late. One Ghost Army soldier described the stress as different but not less than combat. Combat soldiers faced danger from enemy fire, but they could shoot back. They had firepower and tactics. Ghost Army soldiers faced danger while pretending to be something they weren't, armed with carbines and the hope that the Germans believed the illusion. The operations required maintaining deceptions for days or sometimes weeks. During that time, the men had to live in constant readiness for German attacks, while also maintaining their fictional personas if they went into towns. They'd spend days inflating tanks, playing sonic recordings, generating radio traffic, all while knowing German reconnaissance was watching and German artillery could strike at any time. Bernie Bluestein, the art student from Cleveland, later talked about the psychological weight of the missions. You'd be sitting there playing cards with your buddies, surrounded by rubber tanks, and you'd hear German shells whistling overhead. You'd dive into your hole and wait. When you climbed out, sometimes the rubber tank you'd been sitting next to was destroyed. You'd inflate a new one and go back to your card game. It felt surreal. Like reality had become a weird theater production where the consequences were death. The strain showed in different ways. Some men became fatalistic, figuring they'd either survive or they wouldn't, no sense worrying. Others became superstitious, carrying lucky charms, following rituals before operations. Still, others dealt with it through humor, the kind of dark jokes soldiers have made throughout history. One Ghost Army unit created mock awards for destroyed rubber tanks. The purple rubber, they called it, and they'd hang it on inflatable equipment that had been patched multiple times. It was their way of dealing with the stress through humor, acknowledging the absurdity of their situation while honoring the very real danger. The secrecy requirement added another layer of psychological burden. The Ghost Army operations were classified at the highest level. The men couldn't write home about what they were actually doing. They couldn't share their experiences with other soldiers they met. They had to keep everything secret, which meant processing their experiences internally without the relief of talking about them. When they'd pass through towns or interact with other American units, Ghost Army soldiers had to maintain their cover. If they were impersonating the 30th Infantry Division, they had to act like 30th Division soldiers. They wore the patches, they learned the division history. They talked about operations the 30th had been in as if they'd participated. This constant role-playing was exhausting. It wasn't just physical labor of inflating tanks and setting up equipment. It was mental labor of maintaining a fiction, of being actors playing roles where the audience couldn't know it was a performance. After operations ended, the Ghost Army would move to rear areas for rest and resupply. But even then, they couldn't completely relax. They had to maintain their cover identities. If other soldiers asked what unit they were from, they had to give vague answers or claim to be with support units. They couldn't admit to being the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops because that unit designation was classified. Some Ghost Army soldiers developed relationships with other soldiers who'd never know the truth. They'd be friends with infantrymen or tankers, hear about their combat experiences, and couldn't share their own. They had to nod along, pretend they understood, while keeping their actual experiences secret. This secrecy continued after the war ended. The Ghost Army soldiers returned home in 1945, but the unit's operations remained classified. They'd done things they were proud of, saved lives through their deceptions, served their country in a unique and valuable way. But they couldn't tell anyone. Families would ask, "What did you do in the war?" Ghost Army veterans would give vague answers. Camouflage work. Behind the lines. Nothing exciting. Some of these men died never having told their families the truth about their service. The psychological impact of this enforced secrecy is hard to quantify but was undoubtedly real. Veterans of combat units could tell their stories, process their experiences by sharing them, bond with other veterans who understood. Ghost Army veterans had to keep everything inside, carrying experiences they couldn't discuss with anyone. One Ghost Army veteran wrote in his diary, "I've been home for 6 months. Everyone asks about the war. I tell them I painted trucks and worked on camouflage. They look disappointed, like they wanted war stories with guns and grenades. I can't tell them that I helped fool the German army with rubber tanks. I can't explain that I contributed to river crossings and breakthrough operations. So I just nod and change the subject." It's lonely holding these secrets. The Ghost Army operations also created a unique form of survivor's guilt. These men knew that their deceptions had drawn German fire away from real units. They knew that while they were maintaining illusions, real combat soldiers were advancing with less resistance because of those illusions. They'd played a crucial role in operations that saved thousands of lives. But they'd done it with deception rather than combat. Some struggled with whether their service was as legitimate as combat veterans. They'd been in danger, yes, but not the constant grinding danger of infantry and foxholes. They'd contributed to the war effort, yes, but with art and illusion rather than firepower. This internal conflict was compounded by the inability to discuss their service. Combat veterans could bond over shared experiences, talk through their feelings with others who understood. Ghost Army veterans had to process everything alone, without the catharsis of telling their stories. The secrecy finally ended in 1996, over 50 years after the war ended, when the Ghost Army's operations were declassified. Suddenly, the veterans who'd kept these secrets for half a century could finally talk about what they'd done. Interviews conducted after declassification revealed the relief many felt at finally being able to share their experiences. Men in their 70s and 80s, many in declining health, could finally tell their families the truth about their war service. Could finally explain what they'd really done during those years in Europe. Some of them reconnected with other Ghost Army veterans, attending reunions, sharing memories, finally processing experiences they'd carried silently for decades. They'd done something remarkable, something unique in military history, and now they could acknowledge it publicly. But for some it was too late. Many Ghost Army veterans had died by 1996, never having been able to tell their stories. Their families learned after their deaths that their father or grandfather had been part of this extraordinary unit. That the vague references to camouflage work actually meant fooling the German army with inflatable tanks and sound effects. The Ghost Army story reminds us that service comes in many forms, that heroism isn't only about charging in the battle, and that the psychological costs of military service extend beyond traditional combat trauma. These men served in ways that saved thousands of lives, and they did it while carrying secrets that isolated them from sharing their experiences even decades after the war ended. The Ghost Army's effectiveness depended on technology that was sophisticated for its time. Creating convincing illusions required engineering, manufacturing, and technical capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the 1940s. The inflatable tanks were marvels of wartime engineering. Consider the challenges. You need a replica of a Sherman tank that's accurate enough to fool aerial reconnaissance and ground observation from several hundred yards away. It needs to be lightweight enough that a few men can carry and deploy it. It needs to be durable enough to survive field conditions. And it needs to inflate quickly using portable equipment. The solution was inflatable tubes forming a framework, covered by rubberized canvas that formed the tank's shell. The design used physics principles that were well understood but rarely applied at this scale. The inflatable tubes maintained their shape through internal air pressure. The canvas overlay provided the visual appearance while the framework provided the structure. Each tank component was designed separately. The hull was one piece, the turret was another. They were inflated separately, then the turret was placed on the hull and secured. This modular design meant damaged sections could be replaced without scrapping the entire tank. The air compressors used to inflate the tanks were gasoline-powered portable units, common enough in construction and industrial applications but adapted for military use. The Ghost Army carried dozens of these compressors, allowing them to inflate multiple tanks simultaneously and complete a deployment quickly. The manufacturing of these inflatables was a significant undertaking. U.S. Rubber, Goodyear, and other companies mass-produced hundreds of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and other equipment. This required developing manufacturing techniques, quality control processes, and supply chains for specialized military equipment that didn't exist before. Workers like 16-year-old Teresa Ricard, cementing rubber tubes after school for 49 cents an hour, were part of an industrial effort that spanned multiple states and involved thousands of workers. The inflatables had to be manufactured, tested, packed, shipped overseas, and resupplied as field units wore them out or they were destroyed by enemy fire. The sonic deception technology was equally sophisticated. The Ghost Army speakers mounted on trucks called heaters could project sound up to 15 miles in ideal conditions. These weren't ordinary public address systems. They were specialized high-wattage systems designed specifically for long-distance sound projection. The recordings themselves were technical achievements. Creating authentic sounds of military units required careful recording of actual equipment, editing the recordings to create continuous loops, and pressing them onto special phonograph records that could withstand field use. The Ghost Army's sonic library included dozens of recordings, each designed for specific purposes. Recordings of Sherman tank battalions moving had to include the right number of tanks, the right spacing between vehicles, the sounds of tracks on different terrain types. Recordings of infantry units had to include appropriate numbers of voices, equipment sounds, and activities. These recordings were made by actually recording real units conducting real operations. Sound engineers would set up recording equipment near tank units, infantry formations, artillery batteries, and capture authentic sounds. They'd then edit these recordings, sometimes combining sounds from multiple sessions, to create deception soundtracks. The turntables used in the field had to be rugged enough to operate in combat conditions. They needed power supplies, which meant generators that had to be maintained and fueled. The whole sonic system required trained operators who understood both the equipment and the tactical situation. Radio deception involved even more sophisticated technology and technique. The Ghost Army's radio operators used standard military radios, but operated them in ways that required specialized training and skills. Copying another operator's Morse code fist required acute hearing and extensive practice. Every operator had distinctive timing, rhythm, and pattern in how they sent dots and dashes. Some were fast, some were slow, some had particular quirks in their spacing. German intelligence analysts studied these patterns to identify specific radio operators and track unit movements. The Ghost Army radio operators had to study recordings of actual operators from the units they were impersonating, learn those patterns, and reproduce them accurately enough to fool German analysts. This was musical skill applied to military deception, requiring the same kind of ear training that musicians developed. The content of radio messages also had to be technically accurate. The Ghost Army signals intelligence teams studied actual traffic from real units, understanding the types of messages sent, the format used, the terminology employed. They generated fake traffic that matched real traffic patterns so closely that German intelligence couldn't distinguish them. This required understanding military communications protocols, knowledge of unit structures and operations, and the ability to create believable fictional scenarios that matched what real units would be doing. It was creative writing applied to military deception, crafting narratives that seemed real even under scrutiny. The Ghost Army's operations required coordinating all these technical elements simultaneously. During Operation Virusin, they deployed over 600 inflatables, operated multiple sonic trucks playing different recordings, and generated radio traffic for 2 complete divisions, all while maintaining operational security and coordinating with actual 9th Army operations. This coordination required planning, timing, and execution that would challenge any military unit. The fact that the Ghost Army pulled it off repeatedly, often under enemy fire, speaks to both the sophistication of their technology and the skill of the men operating it. The technology also had limitations that constrained Ghost Army operations. Inflatable tanks looked convincing from hundreds of yards away, but were obviously fake up close. This meant the Ghost Army had to maintain security perimeters around their deployments to prevent anyone from getting close enough to see the deception. Sonic deception depended on atmospheric conditions. Wind, rain, and temperature affected how far sound carried and how clear it sounded at distance. The sonic teams had to factor in weather when planning operations, sometimes having to adjust or cancel operations if conditions weren't favorable. Radio deception could be compromised if operators made mistakes or if the Ghost Army accidentally contradicted actual Allied communications. The radio teams had to coordinate carefully with real units to ensure their fake traffic didn't conflict with real traffic in ways that would alert German intelligence. Despite these limitations, the technology worked remarkably well. German intelligence consistently fell for Ghost Army deceptions throughout the war. After Operation Weiersinn, captured German documents showed they'd completely believed the fake divisions were real. German unit dispositions and defensive plans were based on Ghost Army illusions. This technological success had lasting impact beyond World War II. Techniques and equipment developed by the Ghost Army influenced post-war military deception programs. The principles of creating multisensory illusions, of coordinating visual, sonic, and electronic deception, became doctrine in American military planning. Modern military deception is far more sophisticated, using electronic warfare, cyber operations, and advanced camouflage. But the Ghost Army pioneered the fundamental concepts. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, hear what you want them to hear, and believe what you want them to believe. The technology also demonstrated that effective deception required understanding how enemy intelligence gathered information. The Ghost Army studied German reconnaissance methods, understanding what German analysts looked for, how they assessed information, what would convince them. Then they created deceptions specifically designed to exploit German intelligence processes. This intelligence-driven approach to deception was innovative. Earlier deception efforts had been more ad hoc, based on intuition and guesswork. The Ghost Army approached deception scientifically, studying their target audience, German intelligence, understanding how that audience processed information, and designing deceptions that would be convincing to that specific audience. This same approach is used today in fields far beyond military deception. Marketing, public relations, political campaigns all use similar techniques. Understand your audience. Understand how they process information, create messages designed to be convincing to that specific audience. The Ghost Army, in creating technology and techniques for military deception, inadvertently pioneered approaches that would influence fields far beyond warfare. Their legacy isn't just military. It's also about understanding perception, illusion, and how technology can shape what people believe to be real. The Ghost Army's operations in Europe ended in July 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The deception unit that had operated across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany packed up its equipment and prepared to return to the United States. The inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles were gathered up and shipped back. The sonic equipment, the radio gear, everything was packed for transport. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops boarded ships for home, joining thousands of other soldiers returning from Europe. But unlike most returning soldiers, the Ghost Army men carried a burden: absolute secrecy about what they'd actually done. Before leaving Europe, the soldiers were assembled for briefings. Officers emphasized that everything about the Ghost Army was classified at the highest level. The unit designation, the operations, the techniques, everything. The men were ordered never to discuss their service with anyone. Not friends, not family, not fellow veterans. Nothing. The rationale was partly about protecting future operations. If the Soviets, America's new Cold War adversary, learned about Ghost Army techniques, they might develop countermeasures or use similar methods themselves. Keeping the deception capabilities secret protected American military advantage. But there was another reason: embarrassment. The Ghost Army had repeatedly fooled the German military. If the full extent of these deceptions became public, it might damage German-American relations in the post-war period when Germany was being reconstructed as a Western ally. Better to keep the whole thing quiet. So the Ghost Army soldiers came home with instructions to lie about what they'd done. To tell people they'd worked in camouflage or signals or support units. To be vague, to deflect questions, to bury their actual experiences under cover stories. For many Ghost Army veterans, this enforced secrecy became a defining aspect of their post-war lives. Bill Blass returned to New York and launched his fashion career. He became successful, famous, wealthy. But when people asked about his war service, he'd give minimal details. I was in a special unit. We did camouflage work. He couldn't explain that he'd inflated rubber tanks while German artillery tried to kill him. Couldn't describe Operation Viersen or how his work had saved thousands of lives. In later interviews, after declassification, Blass reflected on this secrecy. He said it felt strange building a public career while keeping such a significant part of his life secret. He'd done something extraordinary, something he was proud of, but had to pretend it was mundane. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the 20th century's most important painters. His work sold for millions. His exhibitions drew crowds. Critics analyzed his artistic vision. But none of them knew he'd spent years creating military deceptions in Europe. That he'd painted details on rubber tanks to make them look real from the air. That his artistic skills had been applied to fooling the German army. Kelly rarely discussed his war service even after declassification. He'd moved on, focused on his art, built a career that had nothing to do with military deception. The Ghost Army was something he'd done when young, but it wasn't central to his artistic identity. Bernie Bluestein, the 19-year-old art student from Cleveland who joined thinking it would be safe, came home and tried to resume normal life. He went back to art school, got married, started a family, built a career. But he couldn't tell his wife or children what he'd really done during the war. His family knew he'd served in Europe. They saw his discharge papers. They knew he'd been in a special unit. But they didn't know about the rubber tanks, the sonic deception, the operations close to German lines. Bluestein would sometimes have nightmares, wake up in a sweat, and couldn't explain to his wife what the dreams were about. This pattern repeated across Ghost Army veterans. Men who'd done remarkable things, who'd contributed significantly to Allied victory, who'd saved thousands of lives, couldn't discuss it with the people closest to them. Some Ghost Army veterans found ways to hint at their service without violating security. They'd mention they were in a special unit or did unusual work. Some kept diaries or personal records, planning to someday tell the full story. Others just accepted the secrecy as permanent and tried not to think about their war experiences. The secrecy created isolation. Combat veterans could bond with each other, could attend veterans' reunions, could share war stories. Ghost Army veterans couldn't do that. Their unit didn't officially exist. They couldn't gather publicly without revealing classified information. Some Ghost Army veterans stayed in touch privately, meeting occasionally, careful about what they discussed even among themselves. They'd reminisce about operations using code words, talk around classified details, maintain security even decades after the war ended. This isolation had psychological costs. Studies of veterans show that talking about experiences, processing them with others who understand, helps mental health. Ghost Army veterans couldn't do that. They had to process their experiences alone, without the support network that helps veterans cope with war trauma. A few Ghost Army veterans, feeling the weight of carrying these secrets, did tell their families despite the orders. They'd swear their relatives to secrecy, then describe what they'd actually done during the war. Some families kept these secrets faithfully. Others didn't fully understand or didn't believe the stories, thinking the veteran was exaggerating or confused. As decades passed, the Ghost Army veterans aged. By the 1980s, they were in their 60s. By the 1990s, their 70s. Many were dying without ever having been able to tell their stories publicly. In 1985, something changed. A Ghost Army veteran named Arthur Shilstone, who'd become a successful illustrator, wrote and illustrated an article for Smithsonian Magazine about the Ghost Army. It was the first significant public discussion of the unit's operations. The article caused a stir. Other veterans saw it and realized they might finally be able to discuss their service. Some contacted Shilstone, sharing their own memories and documentation. A network began forming, veterans reconnecting after decades of isolation. But the Ghost Army operations were still officially classified. The article had been published, but the Pentagon hadn't officially declassified the information. So technically, veterans still couldn't discuss details. That changed in 1996 when the Pentagon finally declassified the Ghost Army's records. 51 years after the war ended, the veterans could finally tell their stories publicly. The relief was palpable. Men in their 70s and 80s, who'd carried these secrets their entire adult lives, could finally share them. They gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. They appeared in documentary films. They contacted their families and explained what they'd really done during those years in Europe. One veteran described it as like being released from prison. He'd spent 50 years unable to discuss the most significant experience of his life. Now he could finally talk about it, process it, share it with others who wanted to understand. Ghost Army reunions became public events. Veterans gathered, some meeting for the first time in decades, sharing memories and comparing experiences. They brought documentation they'd quietly kept: photographs, sketches, diaries, equipment. Materials that had been hidden in attics and basements for half a century suddenly became historical records. Families learned the truth about their fathers' and grandfathers' service. Children who'd grown up hearing vague references to camouflage work discovered their fathers had been part of one of the war's most unusual and effective units. Some veterans had died by 1996, and their families learned only after their deaths about the remarkable things they'd done. The declassification also revealed the extent of the Ghost Army's success: 21 major operations across Europe. Multiple successful deceptions that had fooled German intelligence repeatedly. Operations like Weihnachten that had saved thousands of Allied lives. The full story was finally available for historians to study and the public to appreciate. But declassification came too late for many. Of the roughly 1,100 men who served in the Ghost Army, many had died by 1996. They'd gone to their graves having never been able to tell their stories, never been able to explain what they'd really accomplished, never received public recognition for their service. This raises questions about military secrecy and its costs. Yes, protecting information is necessary for national security. But at what point does secrecy become excessive? When does the cost to the individuals carrying secrets outweigh the security benefits of keeping information classified? The Ghost Army veterans waited 51 years to tell their stories. Many of them died during those 5 decades, never having been able to share their experiences. Their families never fully understood what they'd done. Other veterans never knew about the Ghost Army's contribution. History was incomplete because the information was locked away. The Ghost Army story suggests that perhaps military secrecy needs better sunset provisions. Maybe classification should automatically expire after a certain period unless specifically renewed with clear justification. Maybe veterans should be able to discuss their service once threats have passed and techniques have become obsolete. These are difficult questions without easy answers. But the Ghost Army veterans' experience shows the human cost of prolonged classification. They served their country, contributed significantly to Allied victory, and then were forced to hide that service for half a century. The Ghost Army story offers lessons that extend far beyond World War II military history. It's about creativity, deception, perception, and how unconventional thinking can solve problems in unexpected ways. The most obvious lesson is about the military value of deception. The Ghost Army proved that making the enemy see what you want them to see can be as valuable as having more troops or better weapons. Every German unit that moved to counter a fake threat was a unit not defending against a real attack. Every German shell that destroyed a rubber tank was a shell that didn't kill American soldiers. Modern militaries have taken this lesson to heart. Deception operations are now standard components of military planning. Electronic warfare creates false radar signatures. Cyber operations spread misinformation. Camouflage has become increasingly sophisticated. The Ghost Army pioneered these concepts using 1940s technology, and their fundamental insights remain relevant in the digital age. But there's a deeper lesson about how organizations think about talent and capability. The Army could have created a deception unit using traditional soldiers with conventional training. Instead, they recruited artists, designers, sound engineers, and creative people. They recognized that this mission required different skills, different thinking, different approaches than conventional military operations. This recognition that some problems require unconventional solutions, that you need to match personnel to missions rather than forcing missions into standard boxes, remains relevant across all fields. Sometimes the best solution comes from people who think differently, who approach problems from unexpected angles, who aren't constrained by conventional wisdom. The Ghost Army also demonstrates the value of interdisciplinary teams. The unit combined visual artists, sound engineers, radio operators, and infantry. These different specialties worked together, each contributing their expertise to create comprehensive deceptions. The visual deception alone wouldn't have worked without sonic and radio deception to support it. The success came from integration across multiple domains. Modern organizations, whether military, corporate, or academic, increasingly recognize the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. The Ghost Army was ahead of its time in understanding that complex problems require diverse skills working together. The story also highlights the importance of adaptation and learning. The Ghost Army wasn't perfect from the start. Their first operations had problems. Equipment failed. Techniques didn't work as expected. Deceptions weren't completely convincing. But they learned from each operation, refined their methods, and became more effective over time. This iterative improvement, this willingness to experiment and learn from both successes and failures, enabled the Ghost Army to eventually conduct operations like Ryerson with near-perfect execution. They didn't wait for perfect solutions. They tried things, learned quickly, and adapted. There's also a lesson about the nature of warfare and combat. The Ghost Army saved thousands of lives without firing many shots. Their contribution to Allied victory came through deception rather than destruction. This challenges conventional ideas about military valor and effectiveness. We tend to celebrate combat heroes, soldiers who displayed courage under fire, who charged enemy positions or held defensive lines against overwhelming odds. And those actions deserve celebration. But the Ghost Army reminds us that warfare has many dimensions. And sometimes the most effective contribution comes from thinking rather than shooting. The artists who inflated rubber tanks while German artillery fired at them showed a different kind of courage. Not the courage of assault troops, but the courage of maintaining a deception while vulnerable, of trusting in illusion while knowing the consequences if the illusion failed. That courage is no less real for being different. The Ghost Army story also raises interesting questions about ethics and deception. In warfare, deception is acceptable, even celebrated. The Ghost Army's deceptions saved Allied lives and helped defeat Nazi Germany, a regime whose evil justified considerable measures to overcome it. Their deceptions were ethical in that context. But the same techniques used for different purposes could be problematic. Deception in warfare against Nazis is different from deception used to manipulate democratic processes or deceive one's own population. The Ghost Army's technical accomplishments don't automatically justify all applications of deception. This tension between effective technique and ethical application runs through many fields. Marketing uses psychological manipulation to influence consumer behavior. Political campaigns use information operations to shape voter perceptions. These techniques work, but when do they cross ethical lines? The Ghost Army can't answer these questions, but their story illuminates them. They showed that deception can be technically sophisticated and militarily effective. Whether specific deceptions are ethical depends on context, intent, and consequences. The long secrecy surrounding the Ghost Army also offers lessons about transparency and accountability. The unit's operations were classified for valid reasons initially, but keeping them classified for 51 years, long after the techniques became obsolete and the strategic rationale disappeared, served no clear purpose and imposed real costs on the veterans who couldn't discuss their service. This suggests that secrecy classifications should have clearer expiration dates and better justifications for extensions. Information should default to eventual declassification unless there are compelling ongoing reasons for secrecy. The veterans who served deserve the ability to tell their stories, and history deserves complete records. The Ghost Army story has entered popular culture since declassification. Books have been written, documentaries produced, exhibitions mounted. The story appeals because it's unusual, because it involves artists rather than warriors, because it's a clever tale of deception and creative thinking. But there's a risk that the story becomes too sanitized, too whimsical in the retelling. Artists fool Nazis with rubber tanks makes a great headline, but it can obscure the danger, the casualties, the psychological costs. The Ghost Army story isn't just clever and fun. It's also about real people in real danger doing difficult things with significant consequences. The proper way to honor the Ghost Army isn't to romanticize their service, but to understand it fully, to recognize both what they accomplished and what it cost them. to appreciate the creativity and courage required, to learn from their successes and understand their sacrifices. Some Ghost Army veterans have expressed mixed feelings about the attention their unit has received since declassification. They're proud of what they did and glad the story is finally known. But some worry the focus on the unusual nature of their service overshadows the seriousness of their mission and the reality of their danger. They were in a war, people were trying to kill them. Their friends died. They suffered trauma. The fact that they used inflatable tanks instead of real ones doesn't make their service less legitimate or their sacrifices less real. The Ghost Army's legacy lives on in multiple ways. The techniques they pioneered influenced post-war military deception doctrine. The interdisciplinary approach they demonstrated has been adopted across many fields. The story of their service has become part of World War II history. Individual Ghost Army veterans left their own legacies. Bill Blass's fashion house continues. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings hang in major museums. Art Kane's photographs remain iconic. Dozens of other veterans had successful careers in art, design, business, and other fields, carrying forward the creative thinking they developed during their Ghost Army service. But perhaps the most important legacy is the lesson that problems have multiple solutions, that creativity can be as valuable as firepower, and that thinking differently can change outcomes. The Ghost Army showed that warfare isn't only about who has the most troops or the best weapons. It's also about who can think more creatively, adapt more quickly, and use unconventional methods more effectively. In 2013, Rick Baer, a documentary filmmaker, released The Ghost Army, a documentary that brought the unit's story to wider public attention. The film featured interviews with surviving veterans, many now in their late 80s and early 90s, telling their stories on camera for perhaps the last time. Watching these elderly men describe their wartime experiences, you see the mix of pride and pain. Pride in what they accomplished, in the lives they saved, in being part of something unique and important. Pain from the memories of lost friends, of danger endured, of secrets carried for so long. One veteran, interviewed in the documentary, described the emotional experience of finally being able to tell his story. For 50 years, I carried this inside. Couldn't talk about it. Couldn't share it. It was like having a piece of my life locked away where nobody could see it. When it was finally declassified, when I could finally tell people what I'd really done, it felt like being made whole again. Another veteran reflected on the unusual nature of their service. We were artists. We thought we'd spend the war painting trucks. Instead, we ended up in a traveling roadshow, putting on performances for an audience that wanted to kill us if they figured out we were actors. It sounds crazy when I say it out loud, but it's exactly what happened. The documentary also revealed details about specific operations that added depth to the Ghost Army story. Operation Bougainville in November 1944, where the Ghost Army impersonated the 90th Infantry Division while the real 90th Division redeployed for a different operation. Operation Merzig in January 1945, covering the movements of multiple divisions. Operation Trier in March 1945, creating the illusion of a corps-sized force. Each operation had its own stories, its own challenges, its own close calls. The Ghost Army conducted 21 major operations across 11 months of campaigning in Europe. They impersonated over a dozen different divisions. They created illusions that fooled German intelligence repeatedly. The documentary also showed Ghost Army artwork that had been kept private for decades. Sketches of French villages, paintings of the European countryside, portraits of fellow soldiers. The artistic output of the unit was substantial, and much of it was excellent work that deserved recognition beyond its military context. Some of this artwork has been exhibited in museums and galleries, finally receiving the public viewing it was always meant to have. It provides a unique perspective on World War II, showing the war through artists' eyes, combining aesthetic sensibility with military subject matter. In 2019, Congress passed legislation authorizing the award of the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army. This is one of the highest civilian honors Congress can bestow, recognizing significant achievements and contributions to American society. The medal was presented in 2022 to surviving Ghost Army veterans and representatives of deceased veterans' families. By that time, only a handful of Ghost Army soldiers were still alive, all over 95 years old. But they were there, accepting recognition for service performed over 75 years earlier, finally receiving official acknowledgement of their contribution. One of the surviving veterans at the medal ceremony said, This is nice. It's an honor. But you know what meant more to me? When they declassified our records in 1996 and I could finally tell my grandchildren what their grandfather actually did during the war. That's what I'd been waiting for. That comment captures something important about the Ghost Army story. The recognition is appreciated, the awards are nice, but what really mattered to these men was being able to tell their stories, to have their service understood and acknowledged by the people they cared about. The Ghost Army veterans are now almost all gone. The youngest would be in their late 90s. Most have died. Within a few years, there will be no living Ghost Army veterans left. But their story remains, preserved in documents now declassified, in interviews recorded, in artwork created, in books and documentaries produced. Future generations can learn about the artists who went to war with rubber tanks and sound effects, who saved thousands of lives through creative deception, who showed that thinking differently could change the outcome of battles. The physical artifacts of the Ghost Army are preserved in various museums. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has Ghost Army materials. The National Archives has documents and photographs. Private collectors have equipment and artwork. These physical objects connect us to the story, making it tangible rather than just abstract history. A few inflatable tanks survived the war and are now in museums. Seeing one in person is remarkable. It looks so obviously fake when you're standing next to it. The canvas is thin, the paint is crude, the whole thing looks like a carnival prop, but from a few hundred yards away, or from the air, it's convincing. That's the key insight the Ghost Army exploited. Perception is about context and distance, not just the object itself. The Ghost Army story has been told now in books, documentaries, exhibitions, and articles. Rick Bayer's documentary and Jack Neese's book, Ghost Army of World War II, brought the story to popular audiences. Academic historians have analyzed the unit's operations and effectiveness. The story has entered the broader narrative of World War II history. But there are still gaps in our knowledge. Some Ghost Army operations remain poorly documented. Some veterans died before being interviewed. Some records were lost or destroyed before declassification. The complete story will never be fully known, which is true of all historical events but particularly frustrating given how long the Ghost Army remained classified. What we do know is that approximately 1,100 men served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops during World War II. They conducted 21 major operations and numerous smaller deceptions. They impersonated multiple divisions, created the illusion of armies that didn't exist, and fooled German intelligence repeatedly. Their operations contributed to Allied successes at crucial moments, saving thousands of lives. 3 Ghost Army soldiers died during the war. Around 30 were wounded. All of them served under conditions of significant danger while armed with little more than carbines and creativity. They were artists and designers and sound engineers who found themselves operating close to enemy lines, maintaining elaborate deceptions while hoping the Germans didn't call their bluff. After the war, they came home and kept their secrets for over 50 years. Many died without ever telling their families the truth about their service. Those who survived to see declassification in 1996 could finally share their stories, finally receive recognition for what they'd accomplished, finally be understood for who they really were and what they'd really done. The Ghost Army story is ultimately about creativity applied to serious purposes, about unconventional solutions to difficult problems, and about the courage it takes to maintain an illusion when the consequences of failure are death. It's about artists who went to war not with guns but with paintbrushes, not with bullets but with recordings, not with armor but with rubber. And it's a reminder that warfare, like life, has many dimensions, that effectiveness comes in many forms. That courage isn't only about charging into battle. That sometimes the most important contribution is making the enemy look in the wrong direction at the crucial moment. The Ghost Army saved thousands of lives. They did it by lying convincingly, by creating illusions that fooled professional military intelligence analysts, by maintaining their deceptions even when German artillery was destroying their rubber tanks and they were armed with nothing but the hope that the enemy believed what they saw. That's the story. That's what they did. That's why it matters. Bernie Bluestein, the 19-year-old art student from Cleveland who thought he was signing up for a safe job painting trucks, survived the war. He came home, finished art school, became a commercial artist, got married, had children and grandchildren. For over 50 years, he told people he'd done camouflage work during the war. Nobody asked for details. Nobody was particularly interested. Camouflage work wasn't exciting. It wasn't heroic. It was just something support troops did. In 1996, when the Ghost Army was declassified, Bluestein finally told his family the truth. About the rubber tanks and the sonic trucks. About Operation Viersen and the Rhine crossing. About how he and 1,000 other artists had fooled the German army with paint and speakers and illusion. His grandchildren didn't believe him at first. It sounded too crazy, too much like a movie plot. But Bluestein had kept documentation. Photographs, sketches, discharge papers showing his unit assignment. The evidence was real. The story was true. One of his grandchildren asked him, "Grandpa, if you could do it over again, knowing what you know now about how dangerous it was, would you still join?" Bluestein thought about it. About the fear and the danger and the friends who died. About the years of carrying secrets and not being able to tell his story. About the absurdity of inflating rubber tanks while German artillery tried to kill him. "Yeah," he said, "I would. Because we did something that mattered. We saved lives. We helped win the war. And we did it by thinking differently, by using our minds instead of just our muscles. That's worth something. That's worth remembering." The artists who went to war with paint and speakers and illusion, who saved thousands of lives by making the enemy see what wasn't there, who served their country with creativity and courage, who kept their secrets for over 50 years and finally, at the end, could tell the truth. This is their story. The Ghost Army, the most unusual military unit in American history. The men who won battles with rubber tanks, sound effects, and the kind of creative audacity that makes you wonder what else might be possible if we're willing to think differently.